As we stomp through the wasteland, clad in power armor and armed with the most advanced weaponry known to man, it's easy to forget that once upon a time this land was populated with people. People who strive to live a happy and fruitful life despite the hardships that they faced. People who, very much like we the viewer, would have never imagined that nuclear annihilation would one day strip bare all that they held dear. But for a while, things were relatively good. So let's take a look today at what life would have been like for the regular person in the pre-war United States of America. For the sake of this video, we'll be having a look from the time period beginning after 1945, or when World War II ended. Although there were differences between our universe and Fallout's before then, 1945 is listed as when the Divergent Universe truly began to take place. Much like in our universe, the United States emerged from World War II after 1945 as the veritable world superpower. Its economy was surging, its standard of living was reaching heights never before seen, and it remained comfortable in its own security as it possessed the most powerful armed forces in the world. Sources do state that the United States did enter a Cold War with the Soviet Union, with non-canon sources also indicating that the Vietnam War took place much the same. However, it's unknown if other similar armed conflicts such as the Soviet-Afghan War or Korean War took place. Essentially, while the US was in a form of Cold War with the Soviets, these relations thawed without the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and while there were tensions politically in the international arena, it was for the most part a peaceful world for the average US citizen. Ultimately, in the 2000s onwards, pre-war life in the United States of America was based extensively on the 1950s era, ostensibly known as the Golden Age of the American Dream. Classified as retrofuturism, the pre-war era was one of stark contrasts. People wore clothes that your grandparents would think are dated, but had access to more advanced technology than we have now. Housewives cleaned, dusted and mopped, or more so they programmed their robotic servants to do so, once they were invented in 2037. Teenagers would pick up their dates in atomic fusion-powered space vehicles, but chat them up with lines like, "Gee, you're swell, pussycat, you sure know how to swing." During this time, between 2037 to 2077, the United States experienced significant scientific and technological advancements that went beyond our own universe. Nuclear energy became a primary power source, and robots, advanced computers, and futuristic technology became common in everyday life. The American government heavily promoted the benefits of atomic energy and portrayed it as a solution to many societal challenges. However, beneath the surface, the society depicted in Fallout also had some problems. The political tensions between the United States and China were high, leading to a constant state of alertness and fear. Social inequality persisted, with a stark divide between the affluent and those living in poverty. Overall, pre-war life in the Fallout universe was a mixture of technological marvels, societal pressures, and simmering international conflicts, which ultimately culminated in the devastating Great War. As the loading screen states, America in the year 2077 is a land of advanced technological achievements and terrible civil strife. As in any age, most ordinary people want only one thing: a happy, peaceful life. Ultimately, from an outside view, life in pre-war US was pretty good. The society of pre-war America was heavily influenced by a blend of futuristic optimism, consumerism, and Cold War paranoia. Citizens enjoyed a high standard of living, with modern conveniences such as home automation, advanced appliances, entertainment devices, and whatever the heck this thing is. The culture emphasized suburban living, with nuclear families, white picket fences, and cookie-cutter homes being the idealized norm. And this is able to be seen even up to the day of the Great War, as our protagonists Nate and Nora are seen to live in an idealistic neighbourhood, with their robotic Mr. Handy Codsworth and baby Sean. We also get a glimpse of this via pre-war flashbacks of Cooper Howard and his family, as well as the family that Cooper entertains immediately prior to the dropping of the bomb. However, it is important to note that this standard of living was the exception rather than the norm for most pre-war residents. The Howards were in the upper percentile of income earners, given that Cooper Howard was a Hollywood celebrity and his wife was a Vault-Tec executive. Nate and Nora were also fairly well off, with Nate as a celebrated war hero and Nora as a licensed lawyer, as well as the fact that Sanctuary was an actual gated community. For the average citizen though, things were not so rosy. And somewhat as a theme for Fallout, and maybe in our world, the experience of the pre-war universe differed greatly if you were wealthy or if you were not. As Barb Howard accidentally let slip to Cooper, she was working so hard at Vault-Tec to ensure that they were wealthy enough to enter one of the good vaults, rather than one of the experimental base faults applicable for the masses. So yes, for the normal regular Joe, life in the pre-war US was not fantastic. A war in 2060 between European nations and the Middle East had led to the destruction and draining of many of the rich oil fields found in the region, which ultimately had global consequences. By the next year, nearly all traffic in the US had dried up, as fuel became too expensive to be wasted on civilian automobiles, with the estimated cost per gallon being $7,450. As a result, inflation rose dramatically. Pre-war prices seen indicate that even the most basic of goods were incredibly expensive. A copy of the Capital Post newspaper cost $56, while a dozen donuts from Slocum Joe's Cafe would set you back $200. Combined with the impacts of the new plague, a disease which had run rampant in mainland America since 2050, most American families were barely able to make ends meet. The effects of the global wars had been felt by US citizens. However, despite their hardships, they still had been somewhat insulated from war itself. Even when the US pursued aggressive foreign policy initiatives such as invading Mexico to gain access to their oil resources, many citizens came to view this as the US outsourcing their values of liberty and justice for all. However, at the end of 2066, war finally came to the US when China invaded Alaska to seize their oil pipelines for themselves. The upper echelons of the United States had always been self-interested, but now the economy went full throttle into being turned into a war economy, with little interest into the lives of their civilian populations. For example, the Wartime Workers Act was passed, which focused on maximising production during the war, whereby certain industries were expected to work 12-hour days, 6 days a week, with a 30-minute lunch break at most. The act also allowed anyone obstructing work output, a loose term ranging from outright sabotage to simply taking too many toilet breaks, to be charged with treason, punishable by hanging. The combination of all these myriad of factors, the high cost of living due to inflation, rampant disease, wartime stress, and general disagreement with the government, particularly when Canada was annexed, led to much political discontentment. Resource shortages were dire, now not even on fuel but basic necessities such as fresh food and water. Nearly all public funds were diverted from civilian projects into the military, causing publicly funded services such as the police and hospitals to deteriorate. Even the media that the residents could consume became little more than outlets for propaganda. An example of this is Cooper Howard's movie, The Man from Dead Horse, where after the screenwriter was fired as an alleged communist, government influence requested that the story become a new western for a new America. The principal change was that rather than arresting the villain as previously scripted, Cooper Howard was to execute them, as a sign of how Americans should deal with dissidents. However, the United States government sought to redirect their citizens' anger, not at the government who were actually responsible, but at each other. As such, all politically discontented citizens were labelled as having communist sympathies, with a vigilant citizen hotline even set up to allow citizens to report apparent seditious or socialist behaviour to the government. The aforementioned Wartime Workers Act enabled death by hanging to be considered for anyone suspected of having communist tendencies. And xenophobia against Asian Americans ran rampant and was widely encouraged. Executive Order 99066 authorised the imprisonment of Chinese and Chinese American persons, as well as citizens suspected of being sympathetic to communism. Many of these individuals were detained at checkpoints and housed in concentration camps, or utilised in cruel, arbitrary experiments. Even upper-class citizens were not safe from the label of communism. Prompted by a friend of his, Cooper Howard attended a meeting run by Miss Williams, who would one day become Moldova, where she rallied against Voltec and the US government. The actions of which led to herself and anyone associated with her, which came to include Cooper Howard, to be labelled a communist. A term she states is simply a word society used to badmouth anyone at the time who was not insane. Although founded on democratic principles, the United States effectively had become an oligarchy interested in protecting its elites. Miss Williams, or Moldova, was a pre-war scientist working on cold fusion technology that would provide a virtually infinite supply of fuel for the world. However, her work was forcibly acquired and buried by Voltec, as the infinite energy was a direct threat to the US military complex, as well as Voltec's profits, who gained immense gain from the ongoing Sino-American War. And this ultimately represented the key facet of pre-war life in the United States for the common man. As they sought to live in peace, the powers that be instead sought to retain their own power, even at the cost of the planet itself. Having had the preservation of the United States outsourced to them, Vault-Tec instead were aimed at conducting their own experiments on the population, while also ensuring that their executives survived into the future to reshape the world in their image. The United States government itself went underground as the Enclave, with the last US president abandoning their post in the White House to isolate themselves at the Poseidon Energy oil rig in anticipation for the end of the world. And meanwhile, the rest of the population were left functionally to their own devices, somewhat aware that nuclear war would one day strike, but going through the motions until the day it did. And on October 23, 2077, life in pre-war United States formally came to a close, with the survival of its citizens seen as the ultimate example of class inequality of the era. The poor were incinerated or forced their way into Pulaskis, a cheap alternative for nuclear protection on a budget that actually did nothing but entomb the occupants. The middle class entered into their own fortified bunkers with varying degrees of success, and the wealthy, or the lucky, entered the network of Vault-Tec vaults scattered across the nation to survive into the future. Ultimately, despite their purported ideological differences, the average pre-war United States citizen had more in common with the average Chinese citizen than their own leaders. Both were merely pawns in a great game of poker between great powers who had little care to the lives of the people entrusted to them. All these people ever truly wanted were to be safe and lead happy, productive lives. And instead, what they received was nuclear annihilation. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, you know what to do.